Hello, everybody. My name is Andy Dyer, and I'm here to talk about some things you can and can't do with React Native. I'll start quickly about me. I do mostly mobile at Zalando, mostly Android, and we've been exploring React Native for the last year, just seeing if it was something we'd want to use in our apps. And we've done a lot of things from building a prototype chat app to actually rebuilding our shopping cart screen with React Native. Yeah, along the way we've slayed a lot of dragons and learned a lot of things, so I'd like to share some of those highlights with you. Yeah, as the title suggests, we'll start with some things that you can do with React Native. Drake's happy about this. Okay. So yeah, first and foremost, React Native is great for prototyping an app idea, otherwise known as crushing it. Yeah, so like this guy. It's from Silicon Valley, if you're familiar. And then, of course, there's a reason for this, why startups are building their apps with React Native. A lot of it's that you can quickly prototype your app ideas and let you focus on what makes your app unique rather than trying to develop the app twice for 2 different platforms, or even more, because you can currently run React Native on, let's see, Apple TV, iOS, of course, the web, and there's more platforms being added. So yeah, it's trying to live up to the hype of like write once and run everywhere. Okay, so besides being able to update your app, or to prototype your app quickly, another advantage of React Native is the ability to deploy app updates via Microsoft's CodePush. And so the way this basically works, you push an updated JavaScript bundle to their servers. The security-minded of you are probably thinking like dynamic JavaScript, pushing code to a server. This sounds dangerous, but they have code signing and other security features built in. So basically what happens is you push your code up to these servers, and when the app launches, it checks if there's an update, and if there is an update, you can specify how it's applied. They recommend you wait until the next launch to apply the changes. So you don't want the app to completely change while the user's using it. It's just not good. So another advantage of this is bug fixes can ship faster. Basically, any update you want to deploy that doesn't touch native code can be published this way. So it brings some new possibilities that we previously didn't have with normal App Store releases. And let's see here. So moving our focus from business value to career development, another thing that React Native is great for is turning web developers into mobile developers. Anybody who's familiar with React, and pretty much every web front-end developer these days is, feels right at home coming into React Native. But that's not to say that you can just have a bunch of web developers crank out a mobile app. Like we found there were a lot of cases both on iOS and Android where it was very important to have a mobile developer there to get things working. But in the end, the knowledge transfer is very good between both. So as you might guess, the converse is also true. And this is the situation I was in. I did a bunch of JavaScript previously. Back then, everybody was using jQuery. There was no like React or Babel or any of this cool stuff. And then I went off and did mobile, basically since Froyo, so quite a while. On the Android side, and I'd always done a little bit of web like for fun, but I wanted to get back into it, so this was a good way to ease into it. And so like as I was saying with the mobile developers teaching, the web developers some things like goes the other way as well, learning about NPM and all kinds of fun things that we don't typically deal with on the mobile side. So yeah, and then okay, so yeah, now that we've seen some of the things you can't do, or you can do easily with React, with React Native, I'm modifying this slightly to things that you can't do easily, because you can build most things, it just may not be equivalent to the mobile implementation in some cases, and we'll see what some of those are. So this is like probably one of the most difficult things to do with React Native. I've been at a few conferences where people are talking about their approach to doing this, and you might be asking like, why is this difficult? in our situation, we had an iOS repo and an Android repo. The problem here is that the instructions for adding React Native to your app say clone this, or basically you install it into a node modules directory, which doesn't really at first glance like have a place in a mobile app, but you put the code there, and then normally on Android anyway, when you're adding a dependency to your project, it's just in the Gradle file, build.gradle file. But in this case, you're adding a reference from the node modules directory in your build.gradle file. So it's not a library, it's like actual JavaScript code like in your repo. That's a problem when you have two repos, because you either duplicate it or you make a third repo. So yeah, that's what we did. And initially, we had a manual build process to package up our library, and that meant including React Native, any libraries we used that had native code, plus our own React Native features. It's very complicated, very brittle, not repeatable, so obviously not something you want to live with long term. So we found, right around that time, luckily, Walmart, yes, Walmart, they do open source. They open sourced this Electrode native platform, and what this does is it packages up React Native for you. The most recent release, they have a bunch of pre-configured packaging scripts, I guess you would call it, for some of the most common libraries. It's pretty easy to add your own. So it has a pretty steep learning curve. There's a lot of moving parts, but once we had that up and running, we had a distributed team in a different office that was able to push their feature to our internal NPM registry, and we could pull that into our build process, and it's a static library to integrate into iOS and a AAR integrated into Android, and the native developers don't have to know about yarn and yarn start and all these commands that we have to run. So, and then one of the best things it does for you is it brings, it handles version conflicts and things like that, which are pretty common in the JavaScript world for those of you who haven't dove into it yet. So one, I guess, warning maybe is Electrode native updates frequently. So if you decide to use it, you probably want to keep an eye on their GitHub repo, because they're constantly updating it. Each update brings with it the latest version of React Native, which is also a huge win, because it's quite hard, not hard, but there's more work involved to update React Native versions if you're not using something like this. So yeah. Occasionally they make breaking changes, but they're super responsive. I've posted some questions and gotten answers like within a few hours, so definitely worth looking at if you're wanting to integrate React Native features into an existing native app. Yeah, so another thing that may be difficult in some cases with React Native is certain types of animations and UI. Some of this is due to its render cycle. Every time the state changes, it's re-rendering. So animations obviously don't fit in well with something like that. And animation, to be clear, animation is supported in React Native. There's just some types of animations that you might find yourself doing in native. And I can show one example of that here. So this is native, not React Native. This is our shopping cart screen. You see the footer is at the bottom, and it's scrolling with the list, but when you remove it, it's anchored there. It seems really easy, and it wasn't, so just one example of that. But yeah, take a close look at that screen, because shortly I'll show you the React Native version, and I don't have a side-by-side like Eugenio did, but the only way I can tell the difference between our native and React Native, there's two. The picker there is over to the right instead of being centered. We centered it on the new one, because it should be centered, right? And then we also used GraphQL, and there's something called optimistic updates, which means you send your, you post your changes to your mutation to the server, and it'll apply them instantly or ahead of time, like locally. And then when the request succeeds, assuming it was successful, the value stays the same. If it wasn't, you have to handle that case, but makes for a snappier app. Okay. So another thing that's a little tricky with React Native is tablet support. For those of you familiar with Android, usually it involves just duplicating your layout and saying like, okay, this is the tablet layout, and the OS will just pick the right one, and the view IDs are the same in most cases, and you know, it's a lot easier. React Native out of the box does not give you anything to help you with tablet support. So you can query dimensions and orientation and that kind of stuff, but it does require some work to get it right. So as you might expect, there's a third-party library that makes this possible. But yeah, having different layouts for different screen orientations can be tricky. So here we have this is our shopping cart integrated in React Native, or implemented in React Native, sorry. The Chrome around, like the tab bar at the top is native, the badge count's native, so Eugenio talked a bit about bridging. We have to bridge to update that badge every time the cart changes, and yeah, it's kind of tricky. But yeah, the things to point out here, I guess, is the tablet layout. So you see you've got some shipping information at the top, and then there's this big space, and then down here at the bottom, the checkout and the total and all that. And then when you go to portrait, oh, one more thing to point out. Also, the payment methods, a little footer is over here on the right, but then when you go to portrait, everything changes. You don't have the sidebar, you've got this here, there's no space in between the shipping information and that. I think there are even some font differences. So yeah, that was somewhat tricky to implement. It can be done, but yeah, it takes work. And I guess it's probably the same for tablet support in general. It can be done, but it takes extra work. Okay, ooh, what happened? Okay, orientation change handling. So every Android developer here knows the how do you handle orientation changes interview question, and we all know the absolute wrong answer is Android config changes in your manifest. But that's, you go on Stack Overflow and search for handling orientation changes on Android and React Native, and that's what they tell you to do. So there are other ways, but yeah, basically what this is telling the operating system is like, don't worry, I've got this. I'm going to redraw my screen to handle this orientation change myself. But you can lose things like language changes and other things that would also trigger these configuration changes. So it's not a smart thing to do. So yeah, there's no built-in way to handle this. So if you want to save state across orientation changes, that's kind of on you, especially things like scroll position and all that. So yeah, that's another thing that's a little tricky. And then finally, and this is a well-known thing, styling drop-downs or pickers, spinners, whatever you want to call them, on Android, very tricky. With React Native, there's so many Stack Overflow questions talking about this. What we ended up doing is just applying a style in our, just on the native side and the style XML file, and then that just also styled the React Native drop-downs. They do offer a bunch of properties to style it from JSX, but you try them and it doesn't work. So yeah, that's another sore spot. And yeah, here, there's a picker. Maybe I should have changed that slide sooner. And I think I lost my timer, but maybe it's almost time, so I will. I guess to wrap up, yeah, we've seen some of the things that you can and can't do with React Native, some of its challenges. Hopefully you learned some things, and I'm looking forward to the discussion after Damien's talk.